So the first thing I will ask you, and this is my personal beef perhaps, or my personal grievance or fear. Adyashanti tonight over dinner described an episode of traveling from Germany into Switzerland. Would you just describe what happened for you there? And then I'll ask you a question about it.
Many years ago, I was teaching in Germany and Switzerland, and we were in a car, me and several people. I was in the back seat and talking with a few people and not paying much attention to where we were. And all of a sudden, I noticed this really stark sort of change of energy. It felt as if, you know, the kind of feeling like when you're in a dark, cloudy day and the sun breaks through and all of a sudden it feels lighter. And so I felt this very noticeable lightness and a kind of energetic sense of opening. And I asked the people in the car, I said, did you guys feel that? Because it was very strong to me. And they all said, yeah, we felt it. And then one of them pointed out, he said, you know, we just passed the border between Germany and Switzerland, and I looked behind us, and sure enough, we could still see the sign in the rearview mirror, and it was a really stark, energetic, and it was really, you know, I'd experienced the different energies in different places and different environments, but this was probably one of the more powerful shifts from something that felt a little heavier, a little bit more, I don't know, maybe oppressive energy. That's maybe an overstatement to some extent, and then something much lighter.
Okay, so I heard this story, and there's in me an inimitable capacity to draw the negative out of anything. And so when I heard this story, what happens for me? I'm getting, well, this guy travels within Germany, and of course we all know the history of Germany and how different that is from the history of Switzerland. And so we all may understand what this energetic shift is all about. But I wouldn't have that kind of, I've been to Switzerland, I've been to Germany, I didn't feel any of that stuff. And then I read Adyashanti's work, or other people's work on enlightenment. And I'm thinking, well, what kind of when he tells me the story tonight, I'm thinking, what kind of a person would it take to be able to sense and experience that tremendous and obviously palpable energetic shift? Well, it takes somebody very sensitive, it occurs to me. And then my pessimism goes to, well, of course he would have enlightenment experiences because he's that sensitive. So it's almost like there's two kinds of people in the world. Those that are wired for such experiences and those that are not. And he's in one group, I'm in another. So it doesn't matter how much I read your teachings or listen to your tapes or that of Eckhart or that of Almas or anybody else, given that I'm wired differently and my mind isn't wired for that sensitivity and that connection, maybe I don't have a hope in heck of actually getting there. Do you understand my dilemma here? What would you say to that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I would agree to the extent that we're all hooked up differently. Yeah. Just like anything else in life, spirituality is no different. There's people that are inherently like talented violin players, for instance, or just anything, or architects or whatever, and other people that it's more difficult for them. And I think the same thing occurs in spirituality. I think that's fairly obvious. However, I don't think of myself as a particularly energetic person, not when I compare myself like to my wife Mukti. She makes me feel like a knuckle-dragging Neanderthal that energetically wise, that sensitivity, but I obviously have developed it, I think, much more than I did. So I don't really just from the energetic point, I haven't experienced that I grew up and felt energetically sensitive or anything at all. That kind of came through a lot of practice.
But I mean, you might be spiritually that sensitive, though. Is it possible that you're wired for that spiritual experience and other people are not so wired for it?
It's possible.
And if that's the case, then can it be taught? Can it be transmitted, really? Or are people just going to be coming to you to experience your energy, which is
question.
wonderful, or are they actually, if they're not wired for it, are they do I have a hope of having that experience? That's what I'm asking. This is what I'm asking.
No, I get the question, and I appreciate the sincerity and the directness of the question, because it's the kind of question that's easy to sort of, dodge and, so that we all feel really good about all this stuff. But I mean, like I said, I do think that some people have a sort of more of a sort of inherent hookup or talent or whatever you might think of it around spiritual experience. What being a teacher has taught me is that I've encountered a whole lot of people that really didn't think they had any real talent. They would tell me, I have never had anything even remotely like a spiritual experience in my life. I'm intrigued with the idea of it, but I don't feel that I'm, kind of hooked up that way. And I've seen that so far, 23 years of this, that the biggest factor that I've found is when I can get people's mind to open to the possibility that without disagreeing with their basic makeup, like, yeah, you have your makeup, okay, you have that. But if you didn't limit yourself with your idea of a conclusion, right? But neither one of us are making a conclusion, right? I'm not making a conclusion like that. Yeah, anything at all is possible for you. Who knows? How do I know at the end of the day, right? But I have seen that in many instances that this seems like one of the biggest factors is actually just a mind that hasn't closed into conclusions. I saw that when I very first started to teach, that if I could open people's mind, just their mind to a maybe, about, well, lots of things actually, but especially in this regard, because spirituality, the idea of awakening enlightenment, of course, it's clouded in this shroud of specialness. It's made for special people of special talents, and and all of that. And experience has taught me, if I can help open people's mind beyond that maybe it appears that way because that's what collectively we've kind of held and believed, then a lot more becomes possible. That's about as straight as I can give it. And I've certainly seen a lot of people that really didn't think it was possible. I've tried to open their minds up to the possibility of it. And I've seen a lot of people have some pretty big spiritual shifts that really didn't think it could happen. Whether that can happen like for everybody walking around, I don't know.
Okay.
I wouldn't want to come to a conclusion on the positive end of it either. I kind of try to keep it very open-ended.
Okay. Well, that actually leads me to one of the things I noted in your book, you falling into grace. And you say here early in the book that grace is something that comes to us when we somehow find ourselves completely available, when we become open-hearted and open-minded and are willing to entertain the possibility that we may not know what we think we know. So the key word for me in this sentence is we find ourselves completely available. Now that finding occurred to me, it can happen two ways. Finding could be just an accidental serendipitous event or happenstance, where I find something on the ground that I was expecting, but or it can have a very active component. I'm actually looking for something.
Yeah.
So when you say find here, which of those did you mean, or did you mean both of them?
Both of them, for sure. One of the things that when I've talked about grace, I think a lot of us, myself, I would very much say my first experience where I really felt, I'd been graced lots of times in life in different ways, but the first time that I really felt, wow, it feels like pure gift, was something I share with people all the time when I teach. Almost never does an audience brighten up when I say what I'm going to tell you, but it's been my experience that to a large measure, my spiritual path has been a path of failure That the greatest openings have come when I've come to the end of my rope. Certainly in the early years, that was the case. I sort of would exhaust myself until I was despondent, a combination of despondent and exhausted. And that seemed to be a pretty potent ground for grace to happen. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, fortunately. I think that was just because early on there was probably more resistance and things in the way. But I think that's an important thing to consider, because, of course, as a teacher, you see this all the time. People coming up against their limitations, right? Or their perceived limitations, or what they really experience to be a limitation, and they go up against it, and at a certain point you try different strategies and different angles, and you try everything you can, and at some point you might just, and we do everything we can not to be checkmated, right? Not to run out of strategy. We do everything in our power not to get there, but sometimes we do find ourselves there. And certainly in my case, I found that was often, as I said, early on when there was probably more resistance, that's when grace would often occur. Something would happen that would feel like pure gift. It wasn't because I was talented enough to I just surrendered to God. I just surrendered. Well, I tried that, but apparently it wasn't in my capability to surrender in a complete enough way, so I had to go through what I had to go through.
Okay.
As my own teacher says, we all have our dance to dance out in life, and the whole point is just to dance it all the way out. And boy, did I find that to be true.
So when you talk about enlightenment, do you mean those particular experiences that I'd imagine as ones of realization and unity, and I can only use words for it because I'm not conscious of ever had such an experience at all. Do you mean that particular experience, or do you mean something that happens after that experience, or something that you learned from that experience? What is enlightenment for you?
Well, it's a good thing. I like the way you frame that question, because the question was actually my answer, is that it's all, to me, it's all of that. It's, the power, well, experience is what we might call, where you can recount, say, something that happened on a given moment or day or whatever, are like door opening moments, consciousness opening moments. We can call those, some of them, of course not every, in fact the vast majority of spiritual experiences are not enlightenment or awakening experiences. But even if we experience that, of course anybody that's ever had those moments has had the experience of having this, the clouds of consciousness sort of part, and something, a whole new way of being come into your experience. But most of us, certainly when those are when we're early in that kind of experience, we also experience that as human beings, we don't quite live up to it. It's like, it shows us our potential, and what not just our potential, more fundamentally of our essence, our wholeness, you might say, our completeness. But we also have these two aspects of being, a part that spirituality is really pointing to, which is sort of what I call the always and already complete, whole, and there's a sort of intimate connectedness with being, but also there's a human part. And the human part may or may not be deeply sort of penetrated by that experience. We all differ greatly in how deep that goes, and so any spiritual experience will need to be, that in and of itself doesn't just mean you to get the enlightenment certificate because you had an enlightenment experience. The next day, when your kid knocks on your door at an inopportune time or something, then you find out, like, how real is this? So to me, it involves all of that. It involves the door opening experiences. It includes the process, which is not an instantaneous process, the process of embodying that in our humanity, which is generally a very humbling path, very humbling experience, and a deeper understanding. I think to me, it includes all of that.
So if I can get personal here.
Sure.
First about you and then about me. So you've been on this path for decades and you've had these cloud-splitting experiences, as far as I understand. Do you get annoyed in the morning when it's raining, or your wife doesn't look at you the way you want her to look at you, or you say, geez, I wish it wasn't like this morning, or do you live in this peace of acceptance and peace, and just what's it like for you? I just love to know.
I float in the clouds at all times.
That's what
No, my biggest confession moment. My biggest sort of weakness as far as annoyance is almost always around technology. I can get frustrated with my computer or my phone, or if something doesn't work well for some reason, that can push the old upset button pretty easily. In the greater scheme of things, that's not that big of a deal, right? If you think of life like, geez, okay, that's not much to complain about, so I'm certainly not complaining. But that's the thing of this, Gabor, is the way I see this. It's what I teach. It also comes from my experience, and is that we can have these awakening experiences that and not even all awakenings are the same. There's depth to awakening, just like there's depth to anything else. And then that can be very, very sudden. It's not always sudden. That's a kind of myth that they all have to come in mind-blowing moments. They can kind of creep up on you. I've seen people that have awakening experiences that are kind of like, well, I'll be darned. Really? I'll be darned. But I think there's these two aspects that I kind of touched on briefly. There's the revelatory aspect, and that's sort of we see or we don't see. Then there's the human aspect, and as far as I can see, is because we're connecting with something that's experientially is infinite, that the human being has its own infinite capacity to grow into and embody what we realize, and there doesn't seem to be an end to that.
And it doesn't have to be instantaneous.
No, I've never seen a case where it was instantaneous, ever.
Yeah.
Ever. And that's just that's part of the thing that everybody deals with, is like acknowledging that, and then starting to see the gaps between and this isn't just an enlightenment thing, by the way. This is like everybody in this room, you and me and all of us, we all have what we might consider the deepest or most meaningful things that we feel like we know, those, whether it's an insight or an understanding gained from life experience that's you just innately know this is just innately meaningful. And we also know that as human beings, we are always growing towards or away from that, right? And there doesn't seem to be an end where you get to go over some line called total enlightenment or total liberation. And you can claim, okay, as a human being, I now embody the infinite in my limited humanity. And so I think if we're honest, which is always a great protector, if we're honest, is we start to settle into that, and we're like, okay, there's on the relative level, I'm always growing in to what I always and already am. And I think I think it's a more balanced view of all of this than sometimes gets talked about, because we all like extraordinary stories.
Yeah.
But, I was telling you that my own teacher, who I was with for 14 years, she raised 5 kids, and so she was very grounded. And if you had a big old awakening experience, she'd just kind of smile at you and go, okay. Yeah,
That's
okay.
nice.
And then usually within sometime in the next minute, she'd ask you a question like, so how are you getting along with your mom? Just some relational question, because she was like trying to like, it was like reconnect, like this is where it's going to be real, kid.
Yeah, which is really interesting, because when you were telling me that dinner and you first talked about your spiritual teacher, and I asked you if you had a teacher, and you said yes, right away I think of a male.
Yeah.
I never would have thought you were having and let alone a female with kids.
Yeah.
How can that be a spiritual teacher?
Right.
So it's that we have these ideas, right?
Yep.
So
Yeah.
speaking of ideas,
Yeah.
somebody once actually, I've often said, maybe too often said, according to what I've just learned from you, is that I've never had a spiritual experience in the sense of one of those big aha moments, the cloud opening and all that. And yet when people talk about enlightenment, when I read Rumi's poetry or Hafiz's poetry, or I read Jesus, or I read the Buddha, or I read you, or I read Eckhart Tolle, or any one of these people, there's something in me knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And recognize it and guess the truth of it even.
Yeah.
So this one person put a very interesting question to me that I'd like to put to you now, which is it possible that we do have these experiences, we just don't recognize them as such? Because we have a kind of idea as to what they should be like. And since they don't
Yep.
correspond to the idea, we just don't see them for what they are.
It can be. It can be. I've met people like this, like
Yeah.
that. And I'll question them, I'll start to, ask them, and like they might, like I said, some people kind of just slide in there, kind of gradually. And so the idea that it has to always, that enlightenment is defined simply by powerful moments is a misunderstanding, right? So yeah, just because you have a shift doesn't always mean it's going to be immediately conscious, right? The aha is only when the shift is very, very quick and the change of perspective is basically immediate. But what if you had that change of perspective over 5 years? Right? You're not going to have an extended 5-year aha moment.
Yeah.
Right? So, like I said, at the end of the day, this stuff is proved not by. Look, I deeply value awakening experience, obviously, but in the end, it's not proved by those experiences. It's proved in the way we move and function in life. That's the real deal, right? So if somebody says, "Oh, I had this wonderful awakening experience 5 years ago," but you notice they're just really easy to trigger, and their buttons are just all over them, and you can push them really easy, then you kind of go, okay, you might have had an experience, and not to devalue that, but that's not a lived reality right now. Then you walk over to the next person that says, I've never had an enlightenment experience at all. I've never had that. And maybe if you're with them for a while, you notice like they're actually really hard to trigger. Like, okay, so now in the moment, who's actually more enlightened in the moment? You know what I mean? That's what I mean by like the experiences are important, but after those, what's important is, right, how easily do we get triggered? How much are we grabbing hold of identity? How much we grasp onto ideas that aren't really true? All those kind of things. In fact, Suzuki Roshi, who wrote Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind,
Yeah, of course.
he had a really interesting comment one day. He said, don't be so sure you want enlightenment. He said, you may not like it if you get it, which is actually true. If the real deal, you might not like it if you get it. And that comes as a surprise to some people.
And you quote Jesus in your book, somewhat to the same extent, from the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah, you can be, when you can be disturbed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be very, very disturbing to some people. But Suzuki also said, if you do this practice, which is his way of saying, like, if you really commit yourself to a spiritual path, whether you have one of these powerful experiences or not, you may end up actually being in a day-to-day way you move through the world. You may be more closer to enlightenment than someone that has one of those experiences. Right? Not to say that they're the same thing, but I just always been inclined towards the proof of the profundity of our experience is actually proved in our day-to-day experience. It's not proved in the power of a given moment.
Okay.
Right? The moments can be life-changing, but how life-changing they are depends from person to person, right? 10 people can have the same kind of experience, and 10 years later they can be in completely different places in their lives.
So that desire for that particular experience then is what maybe Chogyam Trungpa calls spiritual materialism. It's a kind of attachment to a certain idea of what it...
I think if we're chasing sort of an experience, then that is a kind of spiritual materialism. You know, and there's nothing unique about that, right? We human beings chase all sorts of experiences. You know, when we're buying an 800-inch TV screen, we're chasing an experience that we think is going to give it to them. To me, it can be useful to, at some point, to sort of discriminate between the spiritual impulse as it is in and of itself and as it gets colored by the individual that it's operating through, because the ego will attach its hopes and dreams and wants to the impulse. But the impulse itself is often not what we think it is. It is the very ground of being, or if you want a more psychological interpretation of that, the very ground of the most expansive understanding of the psyche you could get to become self-aware. That's what it's about. It's not, and that doesn't really value whether our journey to that is easy or difficult. It's the human being that goes, well, I want this, and I want this experience, and that's understandable, right? That can be a part of our motivation, and there's nothing wrong with it. But if we really feel into the impulse itself, it has this sort of transpersonal origin.
So what I'm aware of in my mind right now, there's this excitement that the rich possibilities of this conversation, I almost don't know which direction to go in, because they all excite me. But I'll just sort of go randomly with a few.
Yeah. We haven't touched upon bypassing, but we'll get there, I'm sure.
So one is that I want to argue with you, okay?
Yeah.
So let me just find the point where I think I can argue with you, okay? This has to do with this, how do we get there? Like what we have to do with our minds. And let me just find it exactly. Yeah, you say, okay, I got it. I'd like to share with you a short exercise, you say, that will help illustrate what I'm saying. Just for a moment, let's say 5 seconds, and in these 5 seconds, let yourself stop thinking about anything, about yourself, about others, about the day, etc., 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 okay? That's what you say on page 33 to 34, okay? But, Mr. Adyashanti, a few pages later, you say, we don't have control over what we want or think we have, okay? And just look inside your own mind. You don't really have control whether one thought enters you or exits your mind.
Mm-hmm.
So
well, that sounds like a heck of a contradiction, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me so on the one hand, I'm supposed to stop my mind, and you're telling me I can't stop my mind.
Right.
So you tell me about that, please.
Well, I do come from the Zen tradition, so you purposely tie people in knots sometimes, but
okay.
I won't leave it at that. That would be too much of a cop-out. So if we could just stop our mind, which is sort of hypothetical, number one.
Okay.
It may not have come across in this, I don't even remember, but one of the things that I think is really important, I see all spiritual teachings, I think they're related to in the most healthy way as sort of strategies. strategies to awaken or become more conscious or to see deeper or to let go of things, rather than sort of statements of final philosophical existential truth. I think they're medicine. And when it comes to thoughts, I think it's important. I often encourage people, even though it might sound like I'm saying do this or don't do that, let's say, that it's really, I would recommend, I often say to people, that take everything as a question.
Okay.
So, like if we turned that into a question, what you're talking about.
Right.
Right? So what if, so since you can't simply just stop your mind, you can't make that happen.
Right.
Right? Can I listen to what's already quiet? Whether I have thoughts or not.
Okay.
Can I do that? Not a demand, like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do now.
Yeah.
But can I notice that? I find when we sort of turn things into a question like that, then we're not, the ego isn't sort of struggling to make it happen. It's like investigating, which I think is important, because as soon as we make something into sort of a demand, now I'm going to stop my mind. First of all, that's a thought, right? So,
yeah.
And you just elicit all the resistance that might be there. But if you turn it into a question,
but that's
softer.
what happened for me. When I was reading that passage
Understood.
in the book, I actually tried it. And all I could do was think about not thinking.
Yeah, right. Which is a kind of lot of circular thinking.
Yeah.
Now, if you did that for, well, it might take a second, it might take a year, it might take whatever, and at some point it might dawn on you like, oh, apparently I can't just stop my thoughts whenever I want. I seem to be more the recipient of my thoughts than the creator of my thoughts.
Right.
By and large, right?
Right.
By and large. Okay, if I start to see that, maybe something in me just starts to stop trying to make this happen. Oh, I can't do that. Mm-hmm. But there's a way of relating to that kind of limitation in a way that we're taught that when we find something we can't do, we failed, right? Like, I've hit a limitation, I failed, I didn't get it right. But we can also, spiritually, I think it's really important to relate to those kind of moments, like, oh, I can't do that. What's it actually like in my body, in my experience, to realize that I can't stop my mind without trying to? What does it actually feel like? Because usually I can't unconsciously, what we have running in our program, I can't, and that's not right, and I have to be able to do it, and I failed. None of which is, I can't do it. I can't do it is just simple, like, oh, I can't stop my mind. Oh, so what's that like? How does that feel? And the interesting thing is when you let yourself feel that sort of wall, that limitation, your mind often becomes quieter. And it's not a mystery that it becomes quiet. It becomes quieter because anytime we align with the truth, we have a more seamless experience of being. We're in less conflict with ourselves. And we always think the truths are supposed to be truths that I want to know. Like, who wants to know I can't control my own thoughts? Right? But if we let ourselves, that's a truth, if we let ourselves know that truth, it's amazing how our experience becomes more harmonious, right? Because we're simply coming into closer harmony with the actuality of our experience. Right? So you have my sympathy. Number one, I could easily see how you could, take that little piece, right? What I was trying to do was when I usually create it almost as like an imagination. Yeah. If you could stop your thoughts for 5 seconds, and even if you kind of imagine it, like if my thoughts just kind of stop for 5 seconds, what would I lose in those 5 seconds?
Of course, what I could also do with it is, say in this conversation, ask who's the one in me that even wants to argue about it? Like,
That's the deeper question.
yeah.
Yeah.
Rather than just open to it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the deeper question. That's the most fundamental question. When somebody gets hooked on that kind of question, then I start to salivate like a dog. Like, all right, now we're
getting
right.
somewhere.
Yeah.
So you talked about quiet, and I'd like to read you some. This is going to be the last question before we get into the spiritual bypass part. If I can find that quote of yours. Well, you talk at some point about this culture making it very difficult to be silent. Silence is. You talk about the.
It's not a high cultural value. That's for
Silence is not a high cultural value in our society, and so I won't look for the exact quote because you just kind of summed it up. But no, here I actually found it. Revelation and insight come from somewhere else. From some other, from some other space. They come from a place that we as a culture seem to have so little respect for, a place called silence. What's more neglected in our lives than silence, you say? And that reminded me of a great line from the play Joan of Arc, Saint Joan by George Bernard Shaw. Where Joan is this, it's a 15th century story, of course, a true story. And Joan is this simple peasant girl who has voices come to her.
Yeah.
And those voices guide her to go to the Dauphin, the king-to-be of France, and demand that he assume his full role as a leader of his people. And Joan actually is able to lead the French armies to some victories against the occupying English.
Yeah.
So it's in this particular dialogue, Charles, who is now king, as a result of Joan's leadership, says, "Oh, your voices. Why don't the voices come to me? I'm king, not you." And Joan says, "They do come to you, but you do not hear them. You have not sat in the field in the evening listening for them." When the Angelus, which is the ring, the bell that calls some people to a particular prayer, when the Angelus rings, you cross yourself and have done with it. But if you prayed from your heart and listened to the thrilling of the bells in the air after they stop ringing, you would hear the voices as well as I do.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
So talk to us about silence.
I like your sense of humor. Well, I think it's obvious that we don't value silence as a culture that much. Silence seems on the surface to be so useless. Like, it's silent, okay. As I've had a few people say to me, like, okay, it's silent, it's a big deal. What's the big thing about that? And I go, yeah, you got a point. I can understand that surface experience. But silence is, and again, silence isn't something that we need to, the more we're trying to be silent, the more we create conflict. Rather than trying to do that, as I like to say, is just listen to the quiet spaces inside. Instead of fighting with the noisy spaces. You can work on the noisy spaces in some other time or some other context, but listen to the quiet spaces inside. And the thing about silence is that it gives us access to dip underneath the sort of rational, which is often irrational, but the rational intellect, right? Where so much of the noise of happiness. Silence is a sort of an access gainer. That's why almost any contemplative form of spirituality has valued silence, right? Silence isn't the only thing worth valuing spirituality, questioning and challenging our own assumptions, that's really important too. But unless there's a foundation of silence, it's so easy for it to just stay in the realm of the rational intellect, you know? And especially nowadays when we can go on the internet and watch endless amounts of spiritual teaching, and part of that's nice, that there's availability and accessibility. But there's a part of it, remember when I was young with my teacher in my 20s, and I loved reading about spirituality, and I mean, I was just sort of on fire with the whole thing, and I made a deal with myself that I could read as much as I wanted, as long as I meditated as much as I read every day.
Wow.
And so, because I was like, well, I can sit here and reading about silence is really exciting. Perhaps actually engaging in it is at least as useful. And so I did that. And it's no mystery that, you know, people go for walks in the woods or just places where you're just sort of often caught off guard a little bit by the silence and the sense of presence. You walk into a place of sort of sacred architecture. It's meant to evoke a state of being. Sometimes it's awe, sometimes it's simplicity, but there's always a kind of silence that's with that. So I think silence is, and the ground of our being is in silence. That's why you don't have to create silence. You know, we have to create the noise, like the words I'm saying.
So I'm just thinking that before the Big Bang, there must have been silence.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like, silence is kind of like, you know, like the Buddhist word that people get so confused over, like a word like emptiness, you know, and we think, oh, it's just like an empty box. But emptiness is, you know, this isn't the exact sort of Buddhist translation of this, but something akin to, like, since you mentioned like Big Bang, something akin to what there might have been right before the Big Bang. Yeah. That everything came out of an infinitely small something, which is really close to saying a nothing. And that's a different kind of nothing. That's a domain of what I call pure potentiality, right? And I think in our deepest ground of being and our deepest experience of being, we experience ourselves to be a domain of pure potentiality. You know, there's nothing to it. It's like before it's become anything. And that's kind of akin also, it's a close cousin to silence, right? And so there's incredible intelligence, revelatory power. Silence isn't just the lack of sound. It seems like that at first. It seems like that at first, but it's a door opener.
Okay, well that takes me now to trauma.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, because you know, I do have if there's such a thing as ADD, and there's no such thing as ADD as far as I'm concerned, it's a process. But without going into that, my mind just doesn't abide silence very well. Mm-hmm. And I related to the fact that when my brain and mind were being formed, in my earliest moments, even before birth, but especially afterwards, there's a lot of terrible stuff happening around me.
Yeah.
And not to be present to it was a natural way of coping. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about trauma here.
Yeah.
And in this workshop of 100 people that I'm facilitating, and not just in a workshop, but everywhere I go, doesn't matter what work I do, and as a physician, I just found that trauma, in the way I define it, was the underlying dynamic beneath every kind of illness, mental illness, physical illness. I'm not going to try and make that case for you right now, but that's what I found, and a lot of research tends in the same direction. And then you told me yourself, to my delight really, but to my surprise at the same time, that in your workshops, your retreats and so on, you find a lot of people have been, you said 80% or something? You use some, anyway, that you find trauma coming up all the time.
All the time.
Now, the interesting thing is, and that surprised me, and the reason it surprised me is because in none of the recordings of yours that I've heard, or the recordings of Eckhart Tolle, or recordings of H. Almaas, or any of the great spiritual teachers of our time, does the word trauma, as far as I can tell, ever mentioned as such?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, first of all, why not?
Well, all I can do is speak for myself.
Please.
So, like I think I shared with you, especially when I do retreats, when people are doing deeper, really deep spiritual work.
Right.
I mean, some sort of questions about trauma come up on a daily basis. It's rare to get through a day where someone isn't, and I don't mean trauma that's not directly addressed but you think might be there, but I mean just overtly,
Right.
talked about. Someone brings it up to me. So that's usually when it gets talked about, when I really address it, is usually when someone really brings it up. And there's a reason for that. And I'll say this to people when I talk to them. I've educated myself to some extent on trauma. There's probably, I don't know if any of us get through early childhood totally unscathed. I don't imagine I did either, but I haven't experienced myself certainly to have sort of the more heavy traumas that a lot of people come to me. So number one, from an experiential standpoint, I don't have that expertise. From an educational standpoint, I also know that that's not my area of expertise. I don't want to pretend like it is. I will often say when I'm, especially at retreats and when the subject comes up, that I'll talk to people about how they might be able to be with that while at a retreat, but I will often suggest that people reach out to get some really good, specialized help from people who are experts in this. Okay. To think that your spiritual teacher is going to be an expert in trauma is probably unrealistic. I think it's important for spiritual teachers to be open to addressing it and dealing with it when it comes up, and to probably at least educate themselves in some basic way. I've met lots of people who have come to me and they're talking about some inner experience, and it's just terrifying them. Yeah. And I've learned over time to distinguish between the kind of terror, which is this sort of like the ego meeting its existential limitation. That's a kind of terror. People can, when they're ready, they can let go into that. They can surrender into that. But if it's the terror, that's the terror of trauma coming back again. I've met so many people that a spiritual teacher says, just dive in. Yeah. And, well, they tried to dive in and they ended up worse for doing it, right? Because that's not what you want to, as far as I know, that's not the right direction for that kind of fear. So, when someone is like, when I realize, okay, there's some trauma aspect here, I'll suggest that you got to slow the whole thing down, take it in little bites, I won't go into all the pointers, but try to stay really grounded, connected with your body. If you start to get, overwhelmed, don't think you have to just bull your way through it. That's counterproductive. That's what I mean. Like I have an elementary understanding of it, enough to, I think, to give some useful guidance in those situations. But I'm not an expert, and I don't want to pretend like I'm an expert.
No, that's fair
So
enough.
I'm not even sure what I would write in a book, that I would feel comfortable with.
Fair enough, but it's not an argument. I'm just giving you information.
No, I'm not taking it that way.
Yeah,
fair
enough.
Yeah.
From my point of view, it'd be so refreshing if somebody like you or any of these others that I mentioned could actually just say the word.
Yeah.
And say, I may not be the one to deal with it. I may not, but I know it's here.
Yeah.
I know it's affecting many of you.
Yeah.
That would, to me, be really helpful.
Understood.
Yeah, okay.
Understood.
Thank you. Now,
if you listen to enough tapes, you're going to hear it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's there. But
I got to listen to more tapes.
No, don't. No, you don't.
Okay. I was going to meditate, but now I'm going to listen to it.
No, but I understand what you're saying, and I think your point is well taken. It really is, because it's a bigger issue with more people than I would have ever dreamed with when I started out this stuff.
Or me as a physician.
I'm sure. Yeah. And it's an important thing to be able to identify, and for people to get some really good, skilled help with that. Like just those two things right there are just
Okay.
extremely important.
So that then brings me to spiritual bypass and allied to that trauma in the spiritual world.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Suzuki Roshi. I mentioned Turgyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Suzuki Roshi moved here from Japan, founded the Zen Center in San Francisco. And as far as I know, he was he was clearly a great teacher and with integrity. But the man he appointed to be his Dharma heir, his followers, you probably know this,
Yeah.
Whom I don't need to name, but his name is well known, sexually exploited for years
Yeah.
Women in their ashram. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who funded Naropa University and wrote many books of spiritual teaching and steeped in a certain Tibetan tradition, died of alcoholic liver disease.
Yeah.
And also had a lot of women at his sexual behest.
Yeah.
The leader of the Shambhala group that Trungpa founded has recently had to resign. The most recent leader, the one that Trungpa appointed as his Dharma heir, passed HIV onto his lovers, not telling them that he had HIV.
Yep.
The current leader of that same group has just had to resign because of sexual improprieties. I once did an 8-day retreat with Sasaki Roshi, not Suzuki Roshi,
Yeah.
but Sasaki Roshi,
Sasaki, yeah.
who I think was he was Leonard Cohen's guru, he worked at Mount Shasta, and he just died a few years ago, well over age of 100. But when he was in his 90s, there was a front page article in the New York Times that for decades he'd been groping women. This great Zen teacher. And I participated in a retreat, and he really was a wonderful teacher. And I'm not taking anything from their power to teach.
Understood.
And he would grope women, and then when the women would complain, some women would complain, his acolytes, his assistants would say to these women, Buddhism is all about non-attachment. Why are you so attached to your breasts? If he wants to touch your breast, let him touch your breast. What's going on?
Well, first of all, there's a damn big problem in spirituality.
Yeah.
Right? There's a big, big problem. I think that's the first thing that needs to be acknowledged. There's a big, big problem. And there's lots of reasons for that. But I think one of them goes back to the phrase you used to open this last little bit up is spiritual bypassing. I remember reading myself in a book from a Zen teacher that the teachings were basically, I thought, quite sound and good. But when there was a Q&A in the book, and it was asked if Zen meditation is good enough to sort of cure someone of all their psychological, emotional ills. And he said, yes. And when I read that, I was like, that's wrong. Like, the other stuff might have been good in this book, but he's just flat wrong about that one. And I think there's this pervasive, it's through lots of these kind of episodes like you've mentioned, it's slowly starting to change, but not fast enough. But there's this thing, and this goes for not only teachers but anybody, is that, and we touched upon this earlier when we were talking about enlightenment experiences. There's a spiritual line of development, there's human line of development. They do interact with each other, but they are also simultaneously not the same line of development. And you can be very highly developed in spiritual insight and be an emotional child. Right? Maybe you had your own trauma, maybe you just never grew up, maybe becoming a teacher where you were had so much adulation was part of what kept you from really growing up. Like, you know what I mean? That kept you in this sort of more infantile state. And I think what we need more, and I think everybody, teachers and students, need to understand this, that these experiences do not confer human perfection upon you. You can still not have your emotional human ego act together at all, even if you have really big, powerful, spiritual experiences. I mean real ones, not phony stuff. That can happen, and the part of an unfolding is acknowledging like I said, that gap between who you are as a human and what you realize. And that's a different, they're intersecting, so they always have to be, we have to encounter both of these domains simultaneously. But I think we have to get over the idea that spiritual insight is a cure for everything, number one. That it's the same as emotional growth. That's not true. It can help a lot with emotional growth. It can. It depends greatly on people, how much it sort of penetrates into the human domain. But so I think for everybody, for teachers and students, I think we have to be honest about, okay, I'm going after spiritual insight, but yeah, you're also going to have to take care of your emotional baggage along the way, unless you want to end up highly developed in one area and highly undeveloped in another area.
So that, so these people that I mentioned, they were great teachers, and what they taught seems to me very real.
When it comes to Dharma, they can be great, right?
Is it possible, though? I'm asking, I don't. I have a suspicion, but I don't know, that if there's this uneven development that you describe, as great teachers they may be, that somehow wouldn't pollute their teaching at the same time. Or could they be doing great pure teaching and then have this other life on the side that doesn't affect their teaching?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if I can give a great answer to it. Because I think it is sort of a question. I mean, I think there's enough of because these two domains of human experience are interacting but also not the same. The fact that they're interacting, to me, would have to tell me that in some way that lack of development is getting into the teaching in some way. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, obviously you can have people that are very undeveloped emotionally that can give some really great Dharma, but all my intuition tells me that they just can't be separated that much. They can be separated to a great degree, right? It's because it's not true that just because somebody is sort of an emotional infant, and a lot of people get hurt when you're in a position of authority when that happens, it doesn't mean that when they're talking about the Dharma that they may have really great things to say. But I think that's an important thing, like just in spirituality in general, that we don't just measure this whole thing simply by spiritual insight. That we start to measure spiritual insight as part of the picture. It's an essential part of the picture, but the picture is bigger than insight. It's human beings, and it's emotional growth, and it's relational maturity, and it's a lot of things. And I just feel intuitionally that if you're super undeveloped in one way, it's got to affect the Dharma teaching somehow, because they're just not completely
Which is why maybe we're seeing
unattached.
this dysfunction now in several generations after Trungpa and his organization.
That's right.
Well, I'd like to
because you can when you're blind to something, you are often blind to see in others.
That's right.
Right. You just don't acknowledge it. You don't see it.
So, I mean, I'd love to, from the purely selfish point of view, I'd love to just keep talking with you forever. But I do want to give people here a chance to ask you questions. I'm just going to put one more question to you.
Yeah.
And it's related to this issue of spiritual bypass. And if I can get this computer working properly, then you'll hear yourself talk. and then I'm going to ask you to comment on it. So here we are. Where are we? Here we
My
are.
favorite thing, to hear myself talk.
Yeah. You too?
No, it's always like
Yeah.
it's always like listening to fingernails on the chalkboard to my ears.
I mean, people sometimes will come up to me before a talk and say, "I'm really looking forward to listening to you talk." And my answer is, "So do I." So here we go, if it works.
All right.
Why wasn't this working again? Jeez. It worked before. And
Oh, maybe grace on my end has struck again.
okay, let me just try one thing here. I'm not going to keep trying forever. So
All right.
external headphones. Okay, let's see. Okay, let me just try it one different way, because I just really like to use this quote, and I've worked all night to prepare it. And Adyashanti.
If this was
Well,
me
you know
right
what,
about this time, I'd be calling my wife. Mukti, please help.
So
I'm lost.
It's not going to work, but I'll reprise it for you as best
Okay.
I can.
All
We're
right.
talking about the consequences of denial.
Yeah.
And you're actually saying, I believe you're saying pretty much what I've been teaching all week and what I've learned over the decades as a physician, that the consequence of denial, like if you put yourself into situations when you deny yourself, for example, can be deleterious to your health,
Yeah.
and everything else. And that denial can also happen through spiritual work, as far as I understand, because people can put themselves on a cushion and really feel peace,
Yep.
and serenity and joy even. But in their lives, they're denying something,
Yeah.
and they might even be using that spiritual work as a way of getting away from the reality of their lives.
Might even, often.
Yeah, okay. So I just wish you would talk a little bit about that denial and its consequences, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience.
Well, you mentioned some of the consequences, but on a smaller scale than the influence of spiritual teachers on people. I just think for all of us individually, what I found is, I think to be honest with yourself about yourself is about the most challenging thing that a human being can pull off.
Right.
You know, with any consistency. Every now and then when you get pushed in a corner, okay, maybe you do it. But to just really not honest in the sense of, a lot of people mistranslate that as a sort of judgment of things.
Right.
But it's not judgment, it's just being honest and honest and honest. And I take that as sort of one of the central pillars of the spirituality as I teach it. Like, you have to be willing, to whatever extent you can muster, to be really, really honest with yourself. Because if you're not honest with yourself, well, how spiritually awake are you going to be able to get, number one? But in a more human sense, we don't actually get to successfully repress anything. It just comes out in a different form.
Right.
Like you push it down here and it comes out over here. So the denial and the repression thing, it might, squash it in one form, but it's going to come out somewhere else. So none of us get off the hook. And I think it's kind of a ruthless kind of, not like judgmentally ruthless, but it's a difficult, fierce practice to be honest. That's what I was trying to kind of suggest when we were talking about the mind for a moment. Like,
Right.
sometimes just, like when I was learning to meditate, right? And I had a real trouble in the early years meditating. And it was very difficult. I did a lot of it, but it was really difficult early on. And until one day I was with my teacher and talking about my mind and meditation, and just looked at me and said, if you go to war with your mind, you'll be at war forever. And then picked up the bell and rang it, like, that's the end of the conversation, kid. And it was like perfect timing, because I walked out, and it's hard to convey to other people the effect that had when I put so much time, and I was so ardent and trying with everything I had, and all of a sudden I was just told, the way you're going out about it, kid, this isn't going to work, and you can do this forever and get nowhere. And I remember, like, sometimes when you're just stunned by something. And I was walking down the road after that, going back to the meditation hall, and I thought, first of all, you know what? I knew this from the very first time I ever meditated. I knew it, but I didn't let myself know it because it wasn't convenient. It wasn't convenient to know that I couldn't control my mind the way I wanted to. So I pretended not to know that. I denied it, and I went about trying to control it. And I was just told I could do that forever. And I thought, I need a totally different paradigm, completely. And that's when I began to find my own way. I had to first acknowledge what was true about my own experience, that I couldn't control it. And then I get, okay, if that's what's true, now what do I do? And that's when I found a totally different way of going about meditation. And all of a sudden, the war dropped out of it. So that's, very specialized.
Right.
There's emotional denials of piled up infinitely, but I think it's key to emotional work. It's key to spiritual work.
There's the phrase used in Inconvenient Truths.
Yeah, that's a great one, right?
Yeah.
Inconvenient truths. And sometimes the most transformative truths are the inconvenient truths.
Right.
Yeah, we always think truth, it's going to be true because I'm going to feel great about it. Like, not always. Sometimes it's like, oh, God, not that. But then so often, if you can take it in and you stop denying and you reorient around that truth, later you look back and go, wow, that truth, that fierce truth was actually a kind of liberator.
There's that famous saying of Jesus that you will know the truth and the truth will liberate you. And I don't know which American president put a twist on it, and he said, the truth will liberate you, but first it'll make you feel terrible. Something like that.